on the various platforms. You are welcome to the PGS meeting number 168 of the 6th of June 2022. Mr. Newman, if you can proceed, sir.
Thank you, Chairperson. The item that we want to present first with regard to number 5 is really an inspection plan. And this is a 3-year rolling plan of all inspections that we are planning to conduct within the next 3 years, starting from the year 2022, 2023, but also proceeding to 23, 24, and ending up in 24, 25. Chairperson, the reason for these inspections are essentially to ensure that we check for the compliance of the license operations against the license conditions that were issued at the time that they were licensed, but also the provisions of the Act, including the rules and the regulations. Now, the plan also entails aspects of audits that we're going to conduct on the ROMCO pipeline, and I think as members will recall, this is something that we do on an annual basis, just to check on the ROMCO pipeline that indeed the volumes that have been transmitted across the border from Mozambique are accurately reflected and that they are actually passed on to the South African side accurately, such that we can be able to, or SOSO can be able to actually meet the obligation under clause 4.1 of the agreement between Mozambique and South Africa with regard to the volumes of gas that need to be transmitted or transported to South Africa on an annual basis. Chairperson, the facilities that will be inspected have been selected based on a risk-based approach, where we've tried to look and focus and perhaps prioritize facilities that have not been inspected in the past 5 years, number one. Number two, also looking at facilities that are strategically have been identified where we've experienced and encountered a lot of gas supply interruptions. And I think members might recall from the previous reports that we've presented before the committee that there's been a number of those facilities where we've indicated that there has been regular gas supply interruptions. So the targeted approach with regard to these inspections is also just to prioritize those inspections so that we can zoom into those activities and see exactly what is happening. I think the other thing that's just important to highlight is that we've noted that some of these facilities are actually very old. Some of them were licensed in the 60s, others in the 70s and 80s. And we've therefore experienced a lot of interruptions in as far as those facilities are concerned, simply because they've become too old. And I think the other concomitant direct result of that process is that then the maintenance costs on these facilities tend to be extremely high, with the resultant implication on the tariffs when the licensees actually apply tariffs. Chairperson, just in case of matters to emphasize, this list that we've provided, and it's on the inspection plan, starting from page 7 all the way to page 93. There might be facilities as we go on in the 3 years that actually come to light as also requiring inspections or maybe focus. So the list that we've provided is actually open. It's not exclusive in the sense that facilities that the team identifies in the year, in the 3 years to come, cannot be included on the inspection plan. So it's on the basis that where they've identified those facilities that they feel should also be included, will be included, obviously for specific reasons due to agency, but also to deal with certain things that would be identified. Chairperson, the inspections plans are highlighted with regard to the actual plans for inspections in annexures A1, A2, as well as A3. A1 really deals with inspections for 2022, 2023. A2 then deals with inspections for 23, 24. And lastly, A3 deals with inspections for 24, 25, and that is then constitute the 3-year rolling plan. On the audit side, the plans for the audits are reflected under Annexure B1, that's for 22, 23. And B2 contains the plans for 22, 23. And then lastly, B3 then outlines the plans for 24-25. The plan chairperson is to conduct on average about 50 or inspections on 50 of these facilities per year. And I must emphasize that that will be aligned with the APP plan that we've got for the 3 years, because the number of inspections that we conduct is actually, articulated and contained in the APP document. So there will be that alignment to ensure that the two talk to each other. Chairperson, then in terms of the actual plans, we've also tried to highlight, for the benefit of members again, the inspections that have been conducted on specific facilities in the past 5 years, so that we can draw those and identify them for clarity for members, against those that have not been inspected in the past 5 years. And I think members would have noted going through the documents that we've used colors to actually highlight those facilities that have not been inspected in the past 5 years. Those are in red. And the others are actually highlighted in green, which are those that have been inspected. And the others are in orange, where there's been part inspections, in the sense that others of those facilities have been inspected and others have not been inspected. That was just to paint the picture for members with regard to, highlighting the fact that there are facilities that we are targeting that have actually not been inspected or covered in the past 5 years. Chairperson, just lastly then, in terms of the recommendations, those are contained on page 5, and really the recommendation that we are seeking from members is for approval of the plan for the 3 years. Chairperson, I think I'll leave it there, and then so that we can get further guidance and perhaps inputs and questions from members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Numalo, and thanks, Mr. Kumete, for standing in for me. I would like to open the matter for deliberations, and I also take note of the earlier arrangement by the subcommittee that this item be split into 2, so that we only discuss the aspects that relate to Part A, which is for public consumption, and then the other part, then we'll discuss it in a closed meeting. So we'll proceed on that basis, and perhaps even the questions from members, if you could then confine the questions to the matters that are for public consumption. Having said that, I would like to then start off with Mr. Mkhize in terms of input and suggestions and comment. So Mr. Mkhize, followed by Mr. Sibanda, in that order. Members.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks, Mr. Numalo, for the presentation. I just would like to get to understand, when I read, it talks of table 1, but when I go to I've tried, I can't find table 1 marked as such. Maybe it's mine. If you can just assist it by clarifying that aspect. And then secondly, I think it would help to pose certain questions and require the licensee or other related authorities where there's complementary jurisdiction that they assist in providing some of the information. Because my take is that at the end of the day, we want to ensure that there's compliance. First of all, want to get data and information, and then be able to then take corrective action by way of enforcing compliance, which then can be done by various means. And then inspection serves as a verification in the sense that no one can deny what you have seen for yourself. So what is the plan around dealing with the end result or the actual objective, which is getting the data and looking at the data as part of monitoring and compliance, compliance monitoring and enforcement? I just didn't get that with regard to those that are not going to be inspected as such in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mkhize. Mr. Smanda.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to Mr. Nimalo and the team. Chair, I first wanted to probably just get an understanding of the scope of this inspection and audit plan, because when I look at paragraph 8.2, it talks about enforcing compliance with license conditions, applicable codes and standards, provisions of the Act and regulations, and so forth and so on. But then the plans appear to be focused on technical compliance, and if that is the intention, I think then perhaps it needs to be expressed differently in that particular paragraph, because I'm not sure whether we deal with every aspect of compliance and with license and registration conditions, or the focus is just on the technical aspects. For instance, what about aspects such as unlicensed activities and so forth and so on? But looking at the annexures, it seems to me that the focus is just on technical compliance, and perhaps that can be expressed as such. And then the Annex A reflects inspections that would have been undertaken in May. So I wanted to
Is it me that has lost Mr. Smanda?
Same here.
I've lost him too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've also lost this bandage.
Okay, I think it's back. Mr. Smanda, we've lost you for like, I think 40 seconds or so. If you can just repeat the second question that you had.
Oh my goodness. Okay, my apologies, Chairperson. I'm not sure where I got lost, but essentially, I was talking about the scope of the
Unfortunately, we've lost you again, Mr. Smanda.
inspections on.
Sorry, Mr. Smanda, Mr. Smanda, we've lost you again. Let me just, we've lost you again, Mr. Smanda. Maybe we got the gist of the first question regarding the scope, and also where you gave examples of what confuses you with regard to the scope in terms of the paragraphs of the submission relating to the scope and what exactly we have on the actual inspections that are planned, like in the plan itself. So
yes,
if those are not talking to each other, that one we've got. Okay. Then we are now getting onto the second question. That's where we've lost you. Yes, Mr. Smith.
Chair, my second question relates to Annex A1, which reflects inspections that would have been undertaken in May. So I just wanted to check whether those have been done, and if not, perhaps then the plan needs to be amended. Chair, and then I was also indicating that yes, indeed, table 1 appears to be missing. And then lastly, from my side, just an understanding on paragraph 1.17 on page 13. So we talk about one of the objectives of these compliance inspections is to ensure improved communication channels between licensees. So I just need perhaps an explanation or clarification on what that means, or what is the intention around that, Chair. I think that's it from me, Chairperson. Thank you. I think I'll reserve the rest of my comments to the closed session. Thank you, Chair. And apologies for the break in communication.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Smanda. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Ngumalo and the team. Please be brief in terms of the responses and try to be concise and be straight to the point regarding the the essence of the questions that were asked.
Thank you, Chairperson. Just to start with the issue that Mr. Mkhize highlighted first, regarding Table 1, indeed it appears that there might have been an omission of that table, either because of printing, or perhaps it was inadvertently omitted, and that's on page 10 under that paragraph 1.5. But the table really is supposed to talk to inspections in the past financial year, or the sites inspected in the past financial year. I think we'll just correct that, Mr. Mkhize, to include that table. On the second question regarding the other entities, specifically where we've got concurrent jurisdiction, but also how will the data be obtained with regard to just identifying any other facilities that would be necessary to include onto the list in the course of the 3 years. What normally happens is that, for instance, if you take the example of gas supply interruptions, we do get that information quite a lot from stakeholders themselves, even members of the public, who having identified certain incidents of either gas supply interruptions or maybe the gas seeping out of the ground due to maybe third-party damage on these facilities, they would bring that to NESA's attention. But also in terms of the regulations, the licenses themselves are actually required to inform NESA about any incidents that they encounter in the operation of these facilities. And like we've stated in the past, that's supposed to be done within about 48 hours of the incident happening. So there are ways to actually get information about those facilities, and on the basis of such information, we can then include them into the list. But also, as the team members conduct these inspections, they also come across certain instances or incidents in facilities that they would deem necessary to actually pay attention to. Just proceeding to Mr. Sibanda's question with regard to the scope. The plan, I think maybe it's just a matter of wording, Mr. Sibanda, that might actually create the impression that it's more geared or centered around technical compliance, but the intention was not to limit it to technical compliance. The intention was really to actually capture the requirements as stated in the license conditions, number one. That's very important. Number two, the requirements of the Gas Act, as well, including the rules and the regulations, but also with regard to audits on the ROMCO pipeline, like I indicated earlier on. Really, there is a clause of the agreement that was then in place between South Africa and Mozambique that requires the delivery of certain volumes of gas from Mozambique to South Africa. And in addition to that, there are certain gas trade agreements between South Africa and Mozambique that then entail certain aspects and clauses that need to be quite pertinent and important with regard to the monitoring of the accurate delivery of gas through the ROMCO pipeline from Mozambique to South Africa. But again, on the technical aspects of it, those are themselves included in the license conditions, because the license conditions, amongst other things, do specifically refer to standards, technical standards, but also even other relevant areas or requirements within the industry broadly that need to be observed and complied with in conducting these operations. Then with regard to unlicensed activities, unlicensed activities actually are not necessarily covered in this. What normally happens, and this is purely a function of the current wording in the acts, and that happens to be, also the situation with regard to the Petroleum Pipelines Act, where the act actually specifies, makes reference to licensed activities in the main. But I think what's important to emphasize is that in as far as the Gas Act is concerned, it does contain a provision where if there is any activity that is being conducted out there without a license, NESA is actually able to identify that activity and actually make a determination that that is a type of activity that is supposed to be licensed, and to call upon the person that's conducting that to actually apply for the necessary license so that it can then be captured within the framework of licenses that have been issued. think the other issue regarding A1, where it shows the inspections that should have been done in May, I believe that those have been done. Perhaps it was just an omission by the team not to include them, but the team can maybe confirm that. But all inspections that are normally set out to be conducted at any period, we do make an effort to actually go ahead and conduct those, so those would have been conducted. And lastly, under page 13, the improvement in terms of communications channels amongst licensees. I think what we're trying to basically capture there, Mr. Sibanda, was the fact that, you know, compliance as a process is a matter of, at times, experience amongst these licensees, so such that you find that if a licensee has actually been having an encounter with NERSA with regard to non-compliance, once they've addressed that, they've got their own platforms and their own forums where they actually participate and share information. Therefore, based on those experiences, that is the type of channel that they use to actually share these experiences and information amongst themselves to say, well, I had such and such an incident with NERSA and I was found to be non-compliant, and this is how I addressed it so that the others can also benefit. So there is that channel of word of mouth. I think that's what we're trying to capture with regard to that part. Chairperson, I hope to have dealt with all the questions. If there's anything that I've left, I think the team can come in and do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the questions that were raised by Mr. Mkhize, even though he did not mention the words, but taking from the consistent guidance by this committee when it comes to these investigations on interruptible supply, gas supply, in particular on safety issues arising from such incidents of interruptible gas supply, has always been about our role on safety issues, which is actually secondary or very ancillary. And there are bodies that have such a role of enforcing safety issues as their primary regulatory activity or function. Now, in what Mr. Mkhize was asking about the other bodies, even though there's no concurrent jurisdiction, it may well be that there is complementary jurisdiction and there are synergies where we can work together with those other regulatory bodies or regulatory authorities. So the question that is part of what he was asking is really on regulatory cooperation with other bodies or even other associations within the industry. And that has always been an issue that comes up when we consider the reports. Now, it is not, I think his question is that it is not clear from the plan that you have presented. How do you intend to ensure that there will be that regulatory cooperation in ensuring compliance, and even when you undertake certain inspections, targeted inspections? How do you deal with that? That is the question here. How do we fit in the issue of regulatory cooperation? And how will we work with those institutions? And what are the areas or the nature of the issues in this plan that will necessitate or require such a collective or collaborative effort that is not only about NERSA, but with the others? Please respond to that question. And then also the one around by Mr. Simanda, where you were talking about what these inspections are all about in terms of communication. I think you've lost the team, the members there with regards to the purpose. It's as if you say that for providing clear communication and stuff like that. So hence, he then asked as a last question, what is the intention of the inspections? Because that statement was very confusing insofar as the intention of the inspections or the inspection plan is. So those are the two things that you did not respond to. And also be very brief or if there is also another person who would like to answer directly the questions, if that person can also be given an opportunity to come in and answer the questions.
Chairperson, let me start with the last one, just to say that, and we can always enhance that, but what the team was really trying to capture and articulate with regard to that channel of communication amongst licensees is precisely what I've indicated to say, there is a way that these inspections do have a benefit in terms of the direct impact on certain things. And one of those things is actually that channel and platform where these, based on experiences that have come through in the inspection process and how matters have been addressed by individual licensees, then those licensees are actually able to communicate with their peers within the licensing community to say, we've had this type of experiences, and this is how we've addressed those experiences so that they can be the benefit for the others. And I think we must just emphasize, Chairperson, that there is platforms and bodies that these licensees amongst themselves as a grouping do belong to, and they do sit amongst themselves to talk about issues of common interest in as far as the regulation of the pipe gas industry is concerned, and they do indeed have the opportunity at such platforms to share their experiences, including issues of compliance that are important. With regard to the other question pertaining to Mr. Sibanda about the interaction with other regulatory bodies, that is a process that already we are engaged in, Chairperson. During the workshops that we conduct on an annual basis, we do invite these other regulatory bodies, but also in addition to that, we do have meetings regularly at times with the likes of the TNPA, the Competition Commission, where we actually zoom into and look into specific areas, even based on the memorandum of interest of understanding and agreement that we've got with these entities, to basically highlight these areas and look into them and strategize as to how we will cooperate moving further. But beyond that, and we've stated this even in the past, that even where required, we do interact with local government bodies, but also specific and other law enforcement authorities, and we have done this about 2 years ago when there were certain inspections that we had to conduct, and basically we had to rope in source of gas as well as law enforcement bodies around the issue of third-party damage to infrastructure that had then been identified. So it is a process that is already currently in place, and through that process, we are able to get this information, but also that on its own is actually a platform for collaboration with these other entities. Thanks, Chairperson. I think I'll allow the team to also come in if there is anything else that the team would want to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mkis.
Yeah, thanks, Chairperson. I think you have also tried to deal with it, but I just want to request that the team, inspection is one part of a bigger picture that we have of compliance monitoring and enforcement. Then there could be information that you obtain by inspection, which you can obtain by other means instead of going to inspect, and inspection serves as verification. All I'm trying to say here is that you've got those that are in red where you've not done inspection, but by not doing inspection shouldn't mean that you don't get the requisite information in one way or another. It can be the issue of the integrity of that information because you have not done the inspection yourself. So I'm saying look at that broadly in terms of how to bridge the gap of not having done the inspection, but still get the requisite information that you would otherwise get have you gone to do the inspections yourself. I think if you can just get that aspect, wherein then the issue of also if the other bodies that are doing some that are in that same space, there could be information that they provide to you. You can also gathered information instead of not having information at all. That is all that I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mkhize. Just hold on. Just hold on, Mr. Ngumalo, until I give you the platform. I think it is very clear, and now sometimes it wastes the time of the committee, where questions, when they are asked, we always request that please be specific and provide the information, because it's not going to help to go around and not deal precisely with the questions, and try to be as helpful as you can to the members in the way that you respond to the questions. And we also try to, from my side, to try and give some guidance to say that the committee has raised this issue several times, and if you could kindly then show where there are weaknesses, because sometimes the committee, when they ask questions, they ask the questions because they can see the gap. Now they put a question so that at least if you cannot go straight to the part of the submission that then can fill that gap, then you must take that and improve there on the document to indicate that you will take that into consideration. But we're not getting that kind of thing. All that we're getting is explanation, but it doesn't help the members of the committee to then get a better sense of how this is going to be done, whether this is going to be something that will be accommodated in this plan, so that you can quickly facilitate the stage of the decision making, so that we don't spend more time on this matter. If you could kindly deal with that question that Mr. Mkhize has asked, and would like to wrap up this matter for a decision afterwards.
So maybe it didn't come out clear, but I think all that I said, which maybe I need to just repeat for the record, is that we've taken account of the rest of the other, including Mr. Mkhize's input, which is really that, in essence, we must take into account all the issues that are not contained in the current inspection plans. And indeed, we will do that, same as we will do with regard to any other inspections that come to light that are currently not part of the plans. So, Chairperson, we've taken all those matters into account, and we will indeed consider them going forward. Thank you.
Members, yes, thank you, Mr. Mkhize. I appreciate your the position that you find yourself. But in terms of the general comments that are made, I think it is very clear that inspections is just one tool just for monitoring of compliance. And it is also meant just for a verification and assisting the regulator in terms of its fact-based findings. So it's for verification and assisting the regulator in terms of fact-based findings. But it is not the only way of ensuring compliance. And also it is very important to clarify, that is the second thing, to clarify that these compliance inspections are not only meant to deal with technical issues, but there may well be other issues that are considered. For instance, there could well be, these pipelines that have to be repaired, and as a result, there are cost implications arising from that, and those cost implications, they find their way to the tariffs. So there's also those kind of things, and even when you conduct inspections or audits, those audits are not only confined to ROMCO. There must be audits with other licensees, audits that are conducted with respect to other licensees, not only about ROMCO. I think that is what the members also are saying here. And the third thing is that there must be an aspect of the collaborative effort when you conduct inspections, particularly when you frame your issues around safety and environment. So you need to be that aspect, and it must find its way into the plan so that you show the strategic purpose of what you are trying to achieve here. in line with the objectives of the Gas Act. So that part must also be lifted up, and I think that's what the members are saying. So having, and I think the fifth thing that also comes up is the one around unlicensed activities in line with Section 15. Where it details what activities are supposed to be licensed and where they are not licensed. How do we deal with it? It may not necessarily be inspections, but you may also discover it through inspections. So it's not a question of saying that the act is done this way or the other act is done the other way. But the fact of the matter is that all of these activities must be, they require a license. Where then they are not licensed and you discover that, you may discover it through inspections or you may discover it from other sources of information, and you find that they did not come to the energy regulator for licensing or even for registration. What means are you going to use for you to be able to pick up that kind of information? And it happens all the time. Sometimes you get it from the media, sometimes you get it elsewhere. So all of that are things that are meant to ensure compliance. And those are the things that are perhaps not coming out, and by way of examples, because if we don't give specific examples to explain exactly what we mean, then we tend to perhaps lose the members. But those are the 5 things that I wanted to lift up, members, and they will also be looked into in terms of the plan here. Will not be left out. Having said that, members, in terms of summary, I'm trying to get to the recommendations for part A, according to the guide there from Mr. Gumede. Part A, is Part A only about the inspections, or they include the audits? I didn't get that, Mr. Gumede, on the split. If you can just assist me so that I can read out the recommendation properly and should be in line with the earlier resolution that was taken by the committee.
Thanks, Chair. The issue was really about saying that there are aspects of the submission that deal with human resource and finance matters, which are clearly for internal consumption. So I think but Mr. Siban, I think you will probably find that the inspections themselves, we can approve that, but there are other aspects which deal with HR and financial matters, which may require that you suspend the decision. I don't know until those aspects have been discussed as well. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. I think perhaps those could be related to the audits, particularly the audits outside South Africa with regards to the ROMCO one, and some aspects of the inspections could be the reason. But let me give Mr. Mkhize and then Mr. Sibanda, then we can be able to come to the recommendations. But members also taking into account the fact that already we are in June, which is sort of the end of the first quarter in this 3-year period, and just so that we if we can take a decision and then separate those issues that may require that may have financial implications, but at the same time not to compromise the APP targets in terms of inspections and the audits. Mr. Mkhize, then I'll go to Mr. Sibanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairperson. I'm not so sure. I was thinking of an in-principle decision subject to the discussion that is going to be in camera. Then we can proceed, and then we take a final decision after that. But in principle, I just want to say, in principle, I support the recommendation as articulated, subject to the inputs that will talk to finances, etc., being able to execute the task at hand. That is all from my side. Thank you.
Okay, I think that might be easier. Mr. Sibanda?
Yes, Chairperson. Chairperson, I just wanted to clarify that the comments that I have perhaps might not necessarily change the recommendation as it appears. They are just broad comments and probably a discussion at an organizational level and may not necessarily prevent this recommendation from passing, Chair. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Members, would you be comfortable then to approve the recommendations as they stand? And then when we get to the aspect about the governance matter that is related to this, then we can position then to get that kind of clarification that we can approve, subject maybe to financial financial approvals and I don't know, maybe the HR as well in terms of the resources. But let's just put them under financials, because even those resources may require financial resources to be able to execute the plan itself. Mr. Mkhize, is that the support?
Yes,
Okay.
it is a support. I'm raising my hand to support. Thank you.
Okay, members, if you can show by raising your hands just to approve the recommendations subject to financial implications and budget being approved. Oh, yes, thanks, Mr. Tole and Mr. Smanda, Mr. Gumete, Mr. Mkhize, I also support. And I acknowledge you, Mr. Tole. When I stepped out, you were still trying to connect. Thank you. All right, members, we are now moving on to the next item, which is the Sasol gas monthly gas volume balance for the month of April 2022. Please take the matter as read and please emphasize the key things that will talk to the security of that gas supply, because that's what we are monitoring, security of the gas supply from Mozambique to be able to meet the minimum as well as the other volumes that are now covered by GTA2 as well as GTA3. It's all about that security of supply and as well as the variance, whether it meets the international standards, and also the gas that has been in the pipeline there in Secunda for the month of April.
Thank you. This item relates to the volume balance for the month of April. Really, the key issues to emphasize on this one is the fact that the variance is within the acceptable limit, and that limit is 1% as determined in the past. So the variance is below that limit, and normally that indicates that there's really the licensee has actually complied as far as the volumes that have been transported to South Africa are concerned. The other important thing to emphasize, Chairperson, is that for the month concerned, we obtained a total volumes of about 14.6 million delivered to South Africa from Mozambique. And in line with the just assessment and the average that we've determined as having to be met on a monthly basis by the licensee towards actually ensuring that we meet the annual target of the volumes that will be come across from Mozambique to South Africa, is that 14 actually is a positive development. It's actually an increase from that have been supplied on a monthly basis from the past, particularly in the time that we were still affected by COVID. So it is a significant improvement. Another improvement and perhaps a positive signal that is just needs to be emphasized is that if you look at the inventory, and that is on the table in table 1, the inventory for March compared to April actually shows that there was an increase in the amount of volumes that came through in April compared to what came. And lastly, Chairperson, it's just important to emphasize that we've also just given a reflection of all the annual volumes that have been delivered for the past period, starting from 2004 until 2022, and those are shown on page 11. That is just again to complete the picture and to show what has been delivered to South Africa on a yearly basis by the licensee. Just to indicate, and again, areas where there has been higher volumes and areas where there's been low due to specific reasons that we experienced. Chairperson, those are the issues that we can highlight with regard to the volume. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mnumalo, if you can, your volume, please. It's very low and it's in the afternoon, so we want to keep everybody awake. I just want to then get, I think I hope that members have got the sense of whether or not by end of the financial year, we will be in a position to get the total volumes of plus minus 160 million gigajoules, because those are the volumes that we are monitoring on a month-to-month basis. There's minimum volumes that are mentioned, which is 120, but also in terms of what we are assessing, there was also in terms of the agreements, there's a 5% that is allowable on that 120 million gigajoules, which then makes it 126 million gigajoules. Then in addition to 120 million gigajoules, there is 27 million gigajoules in terms of the Komatiport compressor station, of which it has a higher capacity than that 27 million gigajoules. That must then be added on the amount that I've mentioned. In addition to adding the 27 million gigajoules, there must also be 7.8 million gigajoules that must be added in order to cover the volumes that are associated with another tariff that customers in South Africa are paying. So in total, we are getting to almost 160 million gigajoules. So on a month-to-month basis, even with the amount that we have today, the team must be in a position to give comfort to the regulator as to whether or not, if this is supplied or delivered to South Africa for the next 12 months, will it be able to cover that amount? That is the purpose of this report. And the team, it will always be important that you put that statement there for monitoring purposes as to what is the actual figure that at least must of the volumes that must be delivered, and whether with the monthly volume balance that will have been recorded in Secunda, would Sasol be in a position to meet those volumes. So I thought, members, just to fill you up in terms of those different tranches of gas volumes that we are monitoring and the total per annum that we are expecting. Members, any comments on this or any input or maybe some improvements as we're monitoring the gas supply from Mozambique, or any challenges of gas supply constraints that we are foreseeing, or some emerging issues that will constrain the supply, so that at the end of the year we don't get surprises? I think that is basically the reason. If members are then happy with the presentation and the clarification, maybe let me take Mr. Kumede quickly. Mr. Kumede.
Thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity. Just one question, really. Yes, we can see the issue of monitoring the monthly volumes in terms of the gas agreement. But I guess if we take into consideration the second aspect, which is about security of supply, are we perhaps would it be useful, or are we as the team monitoring the progress perhaps with the alternative supply, which is perhaps with Sasol bringing LNG via, which has been reported, I guess, on newspapers, that Sasol is investigating possible sourcing of gas through LNG, but via the Richards Bay port. Are we monitoring that and the implications thereof in terms of basically in terms of everything associated with, including the logistics, and just to actually make sure that in terms of security of supply to gas, that will not be compromised? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think it's part and parcel of this kind of exercise. By the way, it's touched a little bit, but not to the extent. The team, can you please come in there and indicate how do you deal with issues of firstly the gas supply constraints in Mozambique, as we all know that maybe in the next 5 or 4 whatever years, it may be less than that, we might be facing the complete depletion of the resource. So what are you doing there? That's the question. And also it's actually dealing with one of the 10 strategic risk of NERSA with regards to the risk of having a single source and not having diverse sources of gas supply. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Chairperson. I think maybe just to indicate that there has been work in progress between ourselves and Social Gas in terms of just periodic interactions, updates as to what they are doing with regard to seeking alternative sources, and particularly again around the imminent decline of the reserves in Band and Dimani. So we are, regularly having those interactions with Social Gas just to get to understand exactly where they are with regard to alternative measures to make sure that the source of supply for Mozambique can actually be extended even beyond the period of the depletion of the resources in Band and Dimani. And those interactions and discussions that we're having also then touch on any other alternative sources that they might be exploring or considering, such as the importation of LNG. So, and they've indicated that on their side, they're actually hard at work looking into all those alternative sources. But from time to time, they do actually give us an update as to where they are and even the challenges that they're experiencing. So it's something that has not been forgotten. It's something that is actually currently happening in terms of those type of interactions between ourselves and Social Gas with regard to just continuous supply. Thank you, Chairperson. But if there's anything else, maybe the team can also come in and add. Thank you.
Thank you. I think your question, you based it on Sasol Gas, and I guess that's why Mr. Gumede is coming back again, is the approach of answering. The issue of the security of supply is not dependent on Sasol, number one. Mr. Gumede is asking, what is NERSA doing in making an assessment of whether or not there are other alternative gas supply sources, even when we know by now that there could be a challenge with the reserves of which this gas that we are regulating, and the reserves that are nearing their depletion in the next 3 or 4 years. What is it that we are checking for from our side as the regulator that is supposed to facilitate security of supply? What is it that we are doing to ensure that from our side as NERSA, there's some projects that we are undertaking in order to facilitate security of supply? That security of supply of gas is not dependent on Sasol, but on the market. If we make assessment of the market and telling the committee what is it that the team is doing in that front. Mr. Gumede, and then I will take Ms. Sithole, so that we are not seen to be, Mr. Gumede, I'll come back to you once they just listen to the 2 other members, and then you will be able to then note the questions properly and then respond. And I think also the other team members must now come in. Mr. Gumede, followed by Ms. Sithole.
Thank you, Chairperson. And I think you've essentially covered my question. And I think for me, the issue that perhaps where I'm coming from here is that although a particular player, even someone as big as Sasol Gas in this case in South Africa, may have particular plans for itself, but for security of supply, us as a country and NERSA as a custodian of security of supply for gas needs to be on top of plans in terms of what needs to be done. So, for instance, the question that keeps coming in my head is that we kind of know why, perhaps, and again this is in the public domain, that Sasol, because of its concerns around the climate change discussions, and perhaps saying they may not necessarily want to invest in a 50-year asset like a pipeline from Rovuma into which might interface with the existing pipeline. That may well be the strategy that Sasol may have embarked on, and therefore want to then move towards LNG. But it may not necessarily be the strategy. I'm assuming that may be best for Southern Africa as a region for development of the gas resources in the country and in the neighboring countries. So I guess what I'm asking is that to what extent are we, as we monitor this decline from this particular resource, this reserve Pandey and Timani, to what extent are we engaging in terms of orderly development? To what extent are we engaging and ensuring that, for instance, as part of that orderly development, the plans that may well be that Sasol may have, for instance, and I'm going to be explicit here, in terms of maybe they may want to reverse the pipeline at the flow of gas on the Lily side and make the pipe flow, yes, in terms of how it was originally designed to flow backwards. But the question is, would that be the most optimal thing for South Africa? Are we on top of that? Are we looking at this? Whilst we are monitoring the decline for the performance of the existing gas, but we know that in terms of replacement, we may require another 8 to 10 years to actually find a viable alternative. Are we looking at this? If not, who is? Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Kumede. Mr. Tole?
Thank you, Chairperson. And Chair, I just wanted to assist Mr. Ngumalo so that he can recall and respond to Mr. Kumede's question. Mr. Ngumalo, you'll recall in our presentations where we're identifying challenges that we are faced with, especially within the gas industry. We did highlight the issue of the decline in gas supplies, and we mentioned a number of other projects that we had said that we would want government to ensure that those projects are considered and they are started with. So if you can, and we also talked about what is a possible mitigation as well in terms of looking outside of South Africa. So if you can respond in that or recall what we said there, I think it may answer Mr. Kumede's question. Thank you, Chairperson. I just wanted to assist Mr. Ngumalo in responding. Thank you, Mr. Ngumalo. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Tole. Mr. Ngumalo, can you now respond with regards to what is the regulator doing, as the members have provided some more guidance?
Chairperson, I think let me try and perhaps be, and respond much more broadly, so that then we can cover maybe the entire picture about what is it that we are doing really with regard to the issue regarding security of supply. And indeed, let me start with social gas. As I've already indicated, that we are in regular engagement with them just to get a sense of how far they are with regard to alternative sources to boost the supplies from Pandey and Timani. But beyond that, we are also looking at, and we do this research from time to time. We do present it even before the PGS, where we look around quarterly into sources, alternative sources of gas that are likely to come on stream within the industry. Both we look into South Africa, which is the national viewpoint. What is it that is happening in South Africa with regard to exploration for gas sources, alternative gas sources? What are the opportunities that are coming out of that process? But we'll also look regionally to say beyond South Africa, in other countries, and we've mentioned in the past Tanzania, we've mentioned Mozambique, we've mentioned other regional bodies where there has been developments that actually provide promising signals with regard to potential gas sources that might come from those regions. And beyond that, also the issue of importation of LNG from offshore markets, and that we've clearly articulated. And that again continues to be part of what we are considering. And, in our engagement and in our strategy to basically make sure that we gather all this information that is pertinent to, alternative sources of supply, with a view to ensuring that we not only ensure that there will be security of supply, but also that in line with the policy requirements, that there can be diversification of the energy mix to ensure that we're not only focusing on natural gas from Mozambique, but also there can be other alternative sources of supply. We've been engaged even in the past, in registering even other, perhaps less significant and smaller, alternative sources of supply, such as biogas. And we've constantly, basically, reported on this also to the PGS as well. So those are all the things that we are doing, Chairperson, apart from the fact that we are also licensing a lot of LNG projects that are still in the pipeline. Others have already been licensed. But that's, again, another area where basically, we are trying to bring these alternative sources of supply on stream so that, as part of our drive and quest to make sure that, we are not sitting folding our hands, but we are, basically looking into all these issues, to try and find these sources of supply, but also to collaborate with others. Thank you.
All right, thank you, members. Maybe just to go back to the recommendations on this one. Yes, it is important that for this specific one, because the regulation of gas, it started on this particular project in Mozambique, the cross-border project. It is in order when now there are indications of a depletion of the resource, especially in the next 4 years or so, that something is done in terms of assessing the risk, the gas supply risk. So I'm trying to get to that question, Mr. Gumede, that you posed, which then calls on the regulator to have a concerted effort in terms of the initiatives and in terms of perhaps even a document that the regulator may come up with. The method of coming up with it and even engaging stakeholders is another thing. But it is proper for the regulator to then make that assessment, because part of its functions is or strategic objectives that are in our strategic documents and also in the Gas Act, is to make sure that we do facilitate facilitate investments, and also ensure that to the gas services and the gas itself. So to ensure security of supply of the gas resource becomes therefore important and is within our functions and is within the objectives of the Gas Act. And it is also part and parcel of NERSA's overall strategic risk. So all of these things are together. Therefore, the relevant division must, for the purposes of this committee, as this committee is now concerned about the decline and about the fact that we know it has been indicated to us, it's not a secret, that we will therefore be faced with that challenge. What is it that NERSA is doing? Therefore, there must be some concerted initiative and the project that is assessing the risk, that is assessing the other alternatives and all of those things that are important, and be able to bring it to the committee. The pockets of other little things that are being done that are not so focused on this, it's one thing, but that can actually give us some information, because they're just information that is not really focused on this particular challenge or particular risk. Then we need to put the risk properly, do an assessment of it, and look into how it can be ameliorated and what the industry is currently doing, and then be able to give the committee and the regulator the comfort. So we take that into account, and I hope that the secretary will then record it as such, so that the team can start with a project that is focused and targeted into dealing with the risk itself, and that will therefore be scoped properly, and then there will be some sort of milestone reports that are presented to the committee in order to deal with the challenge as we look into the supply outlook from the one resource or one source that we are regulating at the moment. I hope that sums up, and members, you can show by hands that you note the report, and you also note sort of the summary and the resolution of looking into the supply risk in a much more focused and targeted manner. Thank you, Mr. Gumede. Thank you, Mr. Sibanda. Thank you, Mr. Mkhize. I support. Ms. Sithole, are you also in support? Thank you very much, ma'am. We then move on to the last item for the public consumption, which is item number 7, the noting of the round robin for the applications that were submitted by Car Powership. And those applications, I think there's one application that was approved by way of a round robin, and this is just a noting of the application for gas trading, and it is in terms of the 3 ports. By show of hands, members, that you are noting that round robin for the gas trading in the Port of Mocha, Port of Saldanha, and Port of Richards Bay. Thank you, Mr. Mkhize, Mr. Sibanda, and Ms. Sithole, as well as Mr. Gumede. I also support. At this point in time, I would like to thank you all, those that were following us through our various social media platforms, observing the proceedings of this meeting. We have now come to an end in terms of the regulatory matters that were open for the public to observe the proceedings, and we will now stop the live streaming so that we can then consider other governance matters for this meeting. Thank you all. Mr. Mateja, please inform us whether the live streaming has now stopped.